we decided that I would give actually 2 talks. This one would be introducing myself and my background, because many people have asked me about my background and who am I and where I come from, and it's very difficult to answer that question in 2 phrases. So I thought I would talk today a little bit about my background and the early parts of my life. And then in a next talk, maybe sometime in February, I will talk about my professional life. So that's the way we're going to be doing it. And I'll go right away to sharing my screen. And let's see. Okay, you see here personal profile. You see my mug, which was taken some years ago, and you see the part 1, and in grade is part 2, which we won't talk about now, so that I won't talk too much this evening. But I'll give you time to ask me questions which I think you may be considering. So I'll first talk a little bit about the family background, where we all lived, because it's so many different countries and so many different residencies and so many different nationalities. I really don't know which one is applicable sometimes. And because history and politics, we want to keep politics out, current politics, but because past history and politics have affected my family and what happened to us, it's also good to paint a picture of what was happening at the time, at the various stages. I'll talk a little bit about my parents' childhood and on to my early life. So now here is a funny looking map. You may recognize it. It's of the Middle East. And you see here some arrows. So I don't know whether you see my mouse, but you see here at the top you see the country Turkey, you see Syria, and you see Egypt, but it doesn't quite look right. This map was around 110 or 120 years ago, roughly speaking, what was happening then. And you see an arrow going from the Adana in Turkey in 1890, and that's where my grandfather on my father's side immigrated as an Armenian from Turkey to the United States. And then you see a small dotted arrow. He tried to take his family some years later, and he failed. He only succeeded in part of his family because the American government told him his mother was too old and they didn't want older people to be immigrating to America. They only wanted young people. So they battled it for many months, and the family remained in Marseille, France for almost 6 months, enjoying their life of luxury and dwindling his own savings. And finally he gave up, and the family was split up, and half went to America and the other half returned to Turkey. Later on, he decided to come, once he had saved up some more money, he decided to come back and visit his family, and discovered that his mother had just died. So he decided to leave America and settle down in the Middle East in Cyprus. And that's where my mother was born, in 1913. Well, around that time, also surprisingly in Turkey, my father was born in a place called Urfa in 1903. And this was a turbulent time, and I will show in the next slides what was happening. But we are knowing that the Ottoman Empire was crashing down, and there was a lot of danger, massacres, and God knows what else going on. And he escaped to Syria, to Aleppo, and then later on, once he settled down, he traveled to Egypt and worked in Suez and in Cairo and Alexandria. And then on a conference in Cyprus, he was introduced to my mother, and they got married, and then they both moved to Alexandria, where I was born, and in 1962 we left. So, This is just a nutshell of the first part. If I started adding all the other things, the map would look rather too complicated. So I'll go on. This is the greater map showing you the historic surroundings of this early time. And these were the days the mighty Ottoman Empire was slowly crumbling. And when an empire crumbles, it's not a very easy time. And this caused a lot of problems. There was revolution. The Young Turks took over. There was some civil strife, massacres occurred in where Christians, Armenians, or Turks, Assyrians, Arameans, etc., were in a very difficult position, to say the least. And this is the time that both my grandfather was leaving Adana, Turkey, and my father a few years later also left. It was a difficult time. We know that there was persecution. The First World War broke out. There was also suspicions that the Christian population were the fifth column collaborating with the Russians. And so there were many reasons for the massacres to occur in this very difficult time. Somewhere, finally, the First World War was over, but this was a time of great difficulty for many millions. Some 1.5 to 2 million were killed internally, not due to war. And the families of both my parents were also amongst those who were decimated. My father was able to escape, and that's one of the reasons was Urfa was very close to the Syrian border, and he was able to get across the border. Well, this very short trip, that distance to the border was maybe only about 40 or 50 kilometers, to Aleppo longer. He had to pay, how shall I put it, the helpers who took advantage of the situation to arrange train trips. And he was able to purchase a standing room with cattle on a train for his paying his family's fortune. He didn't understand quite what it was. He had some gold pieces in his pockets, and when the smuggler asked him, he asked how much it would cost. The smuggler told him, or the assistant told him, "How much do you have?" And he showed all the gold pieces, and the smuggler said, "Oh, that's just right what we need." Well, it turned out to be a fortune what he gave away, which could have helped him live the rest of his life probably. And he landed in Aleppo, Syria, minus most of the family. He was 10 years old, and without any food to eat, and only with a shirt off his back, in a different country, because Syria had become an independent country, was becoming an independent country by then. He told me, and I didn't pay much attention to it, but occasionally I sat at his feet and listened, and he told me about the early life. He was at first a spoiled child in a fairly well-off family, but things changed as the unrest occurred. And he told me how some days on the way home from school, he would be collared by the soldiers and taken to areas where people had been massacred or killed, and the poor pupils would have to bury the dead. And the only way he could get around this was by carrying a silver coin and paying the soldier to let him off. And one day he had already run out of his first coin when he was caught a second time. and he had to run like hell, and how he hid in a cart of hay, and the soldier ran after him with a pitchfork trying to search for him under the hay, and didn't find him, fortunately, and he was able to escape. So these were the kind of childhood adventures he had. When he arrived in Syria, he starved for the first few days until he, picking up some vegetables at the marketplace, which were left by the sellers on the ground when they were going to be swept away, and as some beggars sometimes do in marketplaces, and I have done that as well in my student days, go to the marketplace, wait till they close up, and then pick up some half cucumbers or bananas that were left on the ground. And I even did that when I was in my 20s as a PhD student in England. So I know what that is like. He did well for himself, and I'll cut a long story short, that he started working for the British and Foreign Bible Society in Egypt. And that was a wonderful time. Egypt was a wonderful country. It was a protectorate of Great Britain, and a peaceful place, and a really nice place to live. This time I won't go into it very much, but the whole world knew what was happening, but nothing much was done about it. And I feel very sad sometimes that this was the case. It's a difficult thing to know what to do when we see terrible things happen in another country. Should we interfere? Should we not? It's really mixed feelings. But they had a lot of trouble even escaping these things. And it was not only the Armenians, but also Assyrians who were massacred. Greeks, Arameans, and Chaldeans also lost their lives. It was a terrible time in those days, but it was a terrible time for many people as well. So he went to this wonderful country of Egypt, and maybe just a little bit about its history. It's an old, very old pharaonic country, one of the oldest civilizations, and the most recent one was the one that links to a certain extent to me and my family, because the Greeks with Alexander the Great conquered Egypt in 300 BC, and many of them remained in the country. And part of my past blood is not just Assyrian, but also Greek. So that brings my link, because in Alexandria, when my father moved there, there were many Greeks who still remained there over the 2,000 years since the last pharaoh, Ptolemaic pharaoh, ruled. And Alexander the Great founded Alexandria, that city that I was born in, and that's why I feel a certain link to that beautiful place, and in many ways beautiful people as well. So the Egyptian language is one of the oldest languages. I'm not talking about Arabic, but I'm talking of the Coptic and Pharaonic language. It has a lot of common with also Greek, because they had a lot of influence. And it was a center of philosophy and science. Many of the Greek philosophers actually made their discovery in Alexandria, which I didn't even know about. Archimedes, when he cried out Eureka in his bathtub, was in Alexandria when this happened. So it was a wonderful place of astronomy, science, and they built the biggest library in the world. And they were very clever. The Ptolemies were very clever. Every time a ship came in, they told the ship's captain he had to loan out his books in order to have them copied. Well, the ship's captain rarely got the books back, but sometimes he got a copy back instead of the original. So in this manner, they made one of the most wonderful libraries, and it was one of the first areas of academic research where scholars reviewed books and documents and wrote scholarly critiques. It's probably the first time in history that had been carried out, and that happened in the city of Alexandria. I won't go too far into this, but Egypt was then conquered by the Arabs in 1640, and the Mohammedanism came to Egypt. But in the first period, it was not really that bad. Well, obviously, when another religion conquers, then you have a problem. And Egypt had become a Christian country, actually. In the first instance, it was it's one of the first countries in the world to be Christian, but not totally. And of course, the other two countries are Assyria and Armenia. So those are my background from my two sets of parents, my two parents. So amongst the first Christian countries in the world, and the one that I was also born in, those three countries were actually the countries associated with my background as well. Islamic dominance was not all that bad always for the country. There was a golden age, and this golden age also assured scholarly advancement. And actually, one of the first universal healthcare systems was made in the Islamic golden age, where anybody of whatever faith, foreign or local, could get help in a hospital and for healing. And this was a wonderful time around the 9th and 10th centuries, which was called the Golden Age of Islam. Afterwards, it got a bit extreme religious, and then followed the Dark Ages, which often happens when religions get a bit extreme. I won't show you the pyramids and all these other places because you've already seen so many pictures, but these are some pictures of Alexandria, one of the amphitheaters, Roman amphitheaters. It was a stone's throw from our house, maybe a 10-minute walk. Then on the right we see the entries to the burial places of Christians, which you can see me here recently visiting Alexandria in 2010 and trying to visit some of the old places. This is not Cairo, this is a small sphinx, and Pompey's pillar. You've heard of Pompey. Well, he got killed in Alexandria as well, and when Caesar went there. And there is a lot left there. These are the catacombs where the Christians were buried, but you see also on the inscriptions, I won't show you all of it, but you see some mixture of Greek, pagan and Roman as well as Christian symbols all mixed together. A wonderful mixture of all of them together. Well, they didn't all agree with each other, and actually amongst the first violent religious people were the Christians, I have to admit. They didn't like the pagans, and they often tried to destroy the pagan temples of the Egyptians, of the original Egyptians religions. So they weren't very tolerant at all. We have intolerance with all religions, and this happened amongst the Christians as well, and they even burnt part of the library which had to do with the old gods. So the Christians also engaged in such terrible activities. The rest of the library was then burnt by the Muslims, and part by nature with earthquakes and part by fires. There were many different sufferings occurred and disasters occurred from various causes, each group trying to blame the other, but many groups were to blame for it. I just go very quickly to the future before I say much about my family. This is a wonderful church that was built over a cave, dedicated this on a mountain in Cairo, and this was partly subsidized by the British and Foreign Bible Society, where my father worked and where our family still donates. A lot of charitable donations of our family go towards the activities here. And this is a very unusual church because the walls of the outside of the mountain have carvings. These are huge carvings, about 4 times the size of a human being, with parts of scripture and the story of the whole Bible carved on the walls, twice or 3 times life size. There's Moses running away from his temptress who tries to tempt him, and he ends up, this is Joseph, I mean, not Moses, Joseph running away, and he ends up in jail until he finally becomes a senior post in the government of the Pharaoh. These small statues here are roughly 1.5 times or 2 times the size of a human. So these are huge carvings on the side of this beautiful church, which is carved into the rock. And this is one of the auditoria of the caves in the mountain, seating between 2,000 and 5,000 people. And this was all dedicated a few hundred years ago by the government of Egypt to the Christians because of a particular occurrence that occurred, and they made a promise to honor the Christian followers and faith in Egypt, and they gave this part to the Christians. So these are the some of the nice things that have happened. This is some of these magnificently huge caves in this mountain beneath this church that are full when the worship takes place several hours. You see, this place is totally full, and they are all singing. People are very religious in Egypt, whether Christian or Muslim. So now, more recent times, I like mentioning Cleopatra because Cleopatra actually had her palace only a couple of kilometers from our house where we lived in Egypt. And we often our most favorite beach that we went to, and we went to a cafe right on the water, was the beach called Cleopatra's Beach. And the various tram stations were called Caesar's Camp, Cleopatra's Beach, and various other historic. Off the coast was Nelson's Island, where he fought Napoleon, and not far away was, in the Second World War, was Rommel fighting also, and our family were trembling, wondering whether the Nazis would come into Alexandria or not. And they even put down in German on the walls, Willkommen, because they didn't want to annoy the Germans if they rolled into the city. The British had already abandoned the city, but the Germans decided not to invade. They thought it was too well protected. But that was the time I was born, and when just as the time that the Germans had finally given up, but the Japanese hadn't. So in my early days, there was a war with Israel, but I didn't know much about it. But the next thing that happened was a revolution, and this we certainly experienced. It was in 1952, and in those days we lived on the top floor of the main street, and we could see the demonstrations and the parades and the chaos all happening before our eyes. Unfortunately, we didn't have a camera, otherwise we could have recorded everything. And these revolutions, part of them was organized by a person called Gamal Abdel Nasser. You probably have heard his name. He was an Alexandrian, and he also, his family didn't live too far away from our family, but we didn't know him then. But I did see him a few times on the street. And when he became president, he once waved to us, because while we were the only people on the street opposite his cars, and well, I waved back, but also shouted some fairly rude comments, because I was always a bit of a revolutionary myself. In those days, Egypt was a monarchy, and a corrupt monarch, because as Egypt became independent of Turkey, the Sultan, the Khedive, was upgraded to Sultan and then upgraded to king. And when King Fuad I died, King Farouk became king, and he was a bit of a drunken womanizer and didn't take care of the country very well. But it was a parliamentary monarchy, but still he had a bit too much power. And lived extremely luxuriously, having something like 24 palaces. Even in the city of Alexandria, he had about 3 or 4. I'm not too sure how many. I've seen 2 of them. So they finally decided to revolt against him in 1952. And the momentous occasion was we were naturally, our family were very disturbed by all of this, because it meant that the British were going to lose their influence, and we as English speakers would have a bit of a problem. So I won't go into all of these. In 53 there was the official end of the monarchy, and then in 54 there was a putsch, and Mohammed Naguib, who was president and wanted to keep the parliament open, was overthrown by Gamal Abdel Nasser, who removed parliament, unfortunately. And this planning of this putsch that Nasser did was in a small city outside of Alexandria, and it happened that my brother, who wanted to go to a beach there with some friends of his, happened upon this small abandoned palace of King Farouk, and happened upon the putsch makers. They were extremely annoyed, and he almost got himself arrested. And they told him to get lost, and he said, well, this is liberated territory. The king is no longer a king. And anyway, they finally got him away, and interestingly enough, the soldiers guarding Nasser in his putsch planning were none other than blonde German soldiers. I think he didn't trust any of his own people. Anyway, finally he organized his putsch, and by 1956 he nationalized the Suez Canal, and then Anthony Eden, who I believe had an ulcer in his stomach, wanted to bring back the British Empire and decided to invade, which was a very unwise thing to do. And so again, our school had to close for a while as we watched the planes above and the bombs dropping, and praying every day that the building we lived in wouldn't be bombed, because it was of the same E-shaped formation as the post office, and the post office was one of the few places that still belonged to the government. Most important buildings belonged to the British and French and other countries. Anyway, it was a very exciting time. Yes?
There's about 3 minutes, so if you would like to entertain questions, there's not much time. And I see you're on page 17 of 34.
Yes. Well, it's of 29, actually. I shortened it.
And it's mighty interesting, I must say, as well.
Yes, if unless you want to formally end, and I can continue a little bit, but yes, I can entertain some questions. Some of them, yes, there's still a certain amount to go. I wanted to present my father and mother, and then some of our family pictures.
I don't know. Let's see if there's a raise of hands, because I mean the history that you're taking us through is something that maybe many of us don't know, certainly not in this detail. So why don't you, if there's no questions at this time, finish with your father and mother, the 2 pages, and really connect history to them.
Okay, so very, very briefly, I already mentioned my father was born in Turkey, and he moved to Syria, and then he became, in 1925, manager at the British and American Bible Societies. It was first British and then became American. He later on, when we moved to Canada in 1962, because we couldn't remain in Egypt after the revolution for very long, we were immigrants. He wanted to continue his work in Christian mission work, and he became the manager and chaplain of a mission for street people. And this is now one of the biggest missions for street people in Montreal. And for many years, until 1980, he worked until he died at 77 on the job which he wanted to do. He died with his boots on. My mother was, I suppose she could have been British and American citizen, but she didn't take up those options. And her mother was of Irish descent, She lost her parents fairly young. At 10 years old, she lost her mother, who died prematurely, and then her father when she was 15. He a little earlier got run over by a car in Alexandria, and then returned to Cyprus where he was living, but in very bad health, and died a few years later. She was mainly a housewife, but her hobby was history, and she did even write some essays on history, and some of them were published in Britain. She also has some unpublished works, but they were not published, and that's the family. That's my mother there in the center. Again, that's me in my very early days. That's me there in the bottom corner, and that's me here. And I'll just go through very quickly. And at the pyramids, and this shows the city of Alexandria. And I just show this because we lived more or less in this center of the city. There was the king's palace with the beach, and here was the king's second palace. And when he was overthrown, he drove using some of the side streets, and he must have even passed our house probably. And then the revolution happened, and there was Nasser in his revolution. This is our taxi outside our entrance. Our favorite taxi. The driver usually let me sit up front and help drive the horse as well. And that's me at school. And it was not all just studying, but we also, after the war, did military training. And that's me again with rifle of sorts. So the trainer, who was a general in the army, called me the British spy. Well, I wasn't a spy or British, but that was my nickname. They all looked at all this with great humor when they took over the Brits and kicked out our British headmaster, and then one of their own became headmaster, which we all, one day, if I can have more time, I'll tell you some of my revolutionary activities at the school.